Okay, welcome everybody today to our ACOM seminars. I am happy to introduce Caroline Womack. She got her PhD in physical chemistry in 6 years ago from now, I guess, from the University of Chicago in the lab of Laurie Butler, researching the dynamics of gas-phase reactive intermediates. She then did a postdoc research at MIT under the direction of Bob Field, studying GG intermediates with microwave spectroscopy. And a few years ago, in 2015, she started at NOAA NRC postdoc fellowship in the tropospheric chemistry program, working with Steve Brown and Rebecca Weschenfeller, and on cavity enhanced spectroscopy to measure trace gases and aerosol optical properties. And she participated in the 2016 NOAA FireX campaign at the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab, the 2017 Utah Winter Fine Particulate study, and she's currently preparing the next campaign in 2019, the FireX AirQ airborne campaign. Welcome, Caroline, and thanks for coming out today.
All right, so is this working? Great. Okay, thank you everyone for coming. I'm going to be talking today about some recent work that we did in our lab looking at wintertime ammonium nitrate aerosol pollution in urban areas, and specifically Salt Lake City, and looking at what we can learn about NOx versus VOC controls as mitigation strategies. So I'd like to start by just thanking the large number of people who worked on this project with me. And just to start off with some motivation, this is a figure of the US that has the current areas that are in non-attainment status with the EPA's 24-hour PM 2.5. And you can see that the areas that are of most serious concern are all in the western US. It's the Salt Lake Valley and the nearby valleys in northern Utah, as well as the San Joaquin Valley and the South Coast Basin in California. But these are yearly averages, so we can gain some more insight by looking at the year-by-year trend. So what I've shown here is the last 20 years of daily PM 2.5 in Salt Lake City, shown in gray, with the average shown in red. And what you can see is that virtually all exceedances of the PM 2.5 standard, shown here, are occurring during the winter. And the same trend is observed in, more so now in the San Joaquin Valley. And it's also a trend that's observed worldwide. So over here, I've plotted the fraction of days in each season that are in exceedance of local air quality standards. So up on the top, we have Salt Lake City, and then I plotted data from the Po Valley and from Beijing, China. And the open circles show summertime data, and the closed circles show wintertime data. And so what we can see is that in all three of these sites, summertime exceedances of local air quality standards are improving or are improved, whereas wintertime pollution events are still quite a serious concern. And of course, this has health repercussions. Lelivald from 2015 estimated that there are 3.1 million premature deaths from PM 2.5 worldwide. And looking more specifically at the Salt Lake Valley, there's this paper from a few years ago that demonstrated that there was an increased frequency in ischemic events, so that's heart attacks and strokes, and ER visits for respiratory distress in the Salt Lake Valley during pollution episodes. So this is clearly a public health issue that we need to understand better. And there's been some work on the Salt Lake Valley specifically because they have these very bad pollution events. And so what's understood currently is that the pollution events tend to occur during what's known as meteorological phenomenon called persistent cold air pools, or PCAPs. And so this is a diagram of the Salt Lake Valley, and you can see that it's surrounded on all sides, almost all sides, by mountains. And during, normally, there's a warmer air at the surface lifts the pollutants away from the local emission sources and lofts them away. But during these persistent cold air pools, a high pressure system moves in over the mountainous area, and it creates this temperature inversion that's lower than the height of the mountainous terrain. And so what that means is that pollutants, rather than being lifted away, build up in the valley for days, sometimes a week at a time, and react with each other and create these pollution episodes. And so a study from a few years ago showed that the PM 2.5, which is shown in blue down there, is highly correlated with the valley heat deficit, which is those gray lines. And what that is just a mathematical formulation that describes the stability of the atmosphere. So the more stable and less turbulent the atmosphere is, the more those pollutants can build up over time, and then that leads to higher PM 2.5. So previous studies have also demonstrated that in the Salt Lake Valley, the PM 2.5 is heavily dominated by ammonium nitrate aerosol. So this is a recent paper by Ale Franquin, who showed that plotted the mass fraction of the PM1 versus the total mass loading. So at lower mass loading, so during clean conditions, the PM 2.5 is relatively split between the different components, but during high pollution events, which is up here, it quickly becomes very much dominated by ammonium nitrate aerosol. And ammonium nitrate is formed from the gas phase reaction of nitric acid and ammonia, which is shown over there. And typically in the Salt Lake Valley, as well as the other valleys that I've been talking about, nitric acid tends to be the limiting reagent. So the formation of ammonium nitrate is limited by the formation of the nitric acid. So the point that I'm trying to make with these last couple slides is that in the Salt Lake Valley, when we're talking about PM 2.5 exceedances, we're talking about wintertime PM 2.5, and that is mostly ammonium nitrate, and that tends to be controlled by the formation of nitric acid. So if you have a PM 2.5 problem, the question you want to ask is, how is that nitric acid being formed? So the questions that motivated this study were, what are the chemical mechanisms that form that nitric acid during these PCAP pollution events? And once we understand a little bit more about how that nitric acid is forming, can we try and predict what would happen under different kinds of control strategies? And it tends to be assumed that when nitric acid is the limiting reagent, then therefore NOx is the limiting reagent for that nitric acid. And what I'm going to argue is that that's not necessarily true, and it's not true in the Salt Lake Valley during these pollution episodes. So the Utah Winter Fine Particulate Study, or UWFPS, was a 4-week campaign that took place in early 2017. There were 5 ground sites that were distributed around the populated areas of the Salt Lake Valley here, as well as the Utah Valley and the Cache Valley. And there was also a NOAA Twin Otter light aircraft, which was making repeated flight tracks around the area during that campaign time. And so the goals were to measure the composition and the concentrations of the gas phase species that are the precursors to ammonium nitrate, as well as the speciation of that PM 2.5. And we were hoping to develop a better understanding of the chemical processes that lead to these pollution events, and then hopefully apply this understanding to other areas that also experience wintertime PM 2.5. So I'm not going to go into all of the details about the campaign, but there were several ground sites. The species that they were measuring is listed over there, and it was a payload that was designed to measure both the gas phase species as well as the speciation and the properties of the aerosol that formed. So to summarize the campaign, during that 4 weeks, we observed 2 major PCAP episodes, as well as the beginning of a third. This was a picture that was taken from the ground, and you can't quite see it, but there's normally a mountain range right there, as well as the plain, which you can just barely make out. And then this was a photo that we took from the aircraft during one of the pollution episodes, and I like it because you can really see the pollution layer about halfway up that mountain range, which really emphasizes that that inversion layer is taking place below the level of the mountainous terrain. So Ale wrote this paper, and You should all read it. And it demonstrated that, yes, there were 2 of these major PCAP episodes in which the PM 2.5 went above the local air quality standards in 2 or 3 of the valleys for multiple days at a time. The gray dashed lines show when the Twin Otter was flying, so we were able to sample a lot of that pollution episodes as well as some clean episodes. And then Erin McDuffie, who is a grad student who just finished in our lab, is about to submit a paper where she looked at the nitric acid versus ammonia limitation of that ammonium nitrate production. So she looked at the ratio of total oxidized versus total reduced nitrogen, and so that's sort of a way of approximating whether nitric acid or ammonia is the limiting reagent. And what she found was that almost all of the time, nitric acid was the limiting reagent. And then Ale also did some isoropia calculations in which he determined that the predicted response in total aerosol mass when you decrease your total NO3 versus your total NH3 is linear in nitric acid and not quite linear in ammonia. And so what this demonstrates is that although reducing both nitric acid and ammonia would likely reduce your ammonium nitrate, it's more linear in nitric acid. So basically what we can conclude from this is that 2017 was a pretty typical winter. Ammonium nitrate was the dominating component of PM 2.5. Ammonia was nearly always in excess, and nitric acid reductions are expected to be effective in reducing that nitric acid, and the ammonium nitrate. So that led us to start thinking about ways that we could model the nitric acid formation. So before I get too much into the details of that, I do want to talk briefly about the chemistry that goes into forming nitric acid. So this is the Hox-NOx cycle, probably pretty familiar. It's the dominant mechanism for generating ozone in the troposphere, and it's driven by these local emissions of VOCs and NOx. And traditionally, the parameter Ox, or ozone plus NO2, has been used to describe daytime photochemical oxidation of VOCs, because by looking at the sum of ozone and NO2, it allows you to look past this rapid interconversion and just look at the role that the VOC's oxidation is playing in the generation of that ozone. But this chemistry is also the chemistry that creates nitric acid. So we can expand this a little bit further. Nitric acid can be formed from the reaction of OH and NO2, and then it typically immediately forms particulate nitrate, so use that notation up there. And then also there's a whole branch of the chemistry that occurs just at night, where ozone titrates with the NO2 to form NO3 and 2O5, which gets taken up on aerosol to make nitric acid as well. And so we can start using a more general term, which we're calling Ox total. And what that is the sum of not just ozone and NO2, but all of these other nighttime and other species. And so what this allows us to do is look at the photochemical production of either ozone or nitric acid, and it emphasizes how closely those two are related. And so in an analogous way to the traditional definition for Ox, if you just look at this nighttime chemistry, you wouldn't expect the total Ox to change at all. It would just repartition between the different components. So a growth in total Ox would be an indication of what this photochemical mechanism is playing in the production of nitric acid. Another way to think about it is if you're an NOI person, we kind of think of NOY to NOx being similar to the Ox total to Ox. So it's two ways of defining not just the species of interest, but also the things that it can react to form. So the first thing that we did was to look at Twin Otter vertical profiles in the Salt Lake Valley. So this is a typical altitude profile from one of our flights, and you can see that we were mostly spending most of the time in the polluted boundary layer, but we were also doing some vertical profiling, including all the way up and out into the free troposphere. So on the left over here, we have an example of a clean day vertical profile. So the total ox is shown in the black line, and it's colored by the different components. So what you can see is all the way through the inversion layer, as well as in the free troposphere, there's a fairly consistent amount of ox total, and it is all made up of ozone, except for a tiny bit down at the surface. But then we decided to look at polluted conditions. And again, like I was saying in the previous slide, if only nighttime chemistry was occurring, if there's no photochemistry, we'd expect for that total amount to stay consistent, but maybe repartition between different components. But what we saw instead was, in addition to repartitioning, it was also growing significantly beyond what we'd call that total ox budget that was still evident above the inversion layer height. And this was seen from the aircraft, but it was also seen from the ground site. So this is allowed us to look at more complete temporal coverage. So this is from the University of Utah site. And again, the coloring is the same, with ox total shown in black and the different components shown in different colors. And down here, I've just plotted it as a fraction of the total. And so what you can see is that during clean conditions, it's pretty consistent, around 45 ppb, and it's mostly ozone. But then when that pollution episode starts up, we see this steady growth in ox total, as well as a repartitioning of its components to go from mostly ozone to mostly NO2 and particulate nitrate. And so what this is an indication to us is that there is some photochemistry that's occurring here. And at first that was a little surprising to us, but maybe it shouldn't have been, because 5 years before this, our group also participated in a similar study in northern Utah in the Uinta Basin. And so this was the Uinta Basin Winter Ozone Study, which took place over a couple of years, 2012 to 2014. And the goal was to try and understand why these high ozone events were occurring during the winter. So this is the Uinta Basin over here in northeastern Utah. And they were observing these really high levels of ozone that were only occurring during the winter. And Pete Edwards, who's shown down there, was a postdoc in our group. And he demonstrated using a photochemical box model that you could attribute that ozone growth to the photochemical oxidation of the very large amount of VOCs that were being produced by the oil and natural gas production there. So he did this photochemical box model, and you can see the comparison between the observed and the modeled, and he was able to attribute that behavior to the VOCs generating radicals, which would then start this ozone production. So we can take that data and try and think about it in the same context as the ox total. So that's what I've done in this this figure. So we're back to Salt Lake City. So that's over here on the left. This is the same figure that I showed before. And over here, we're looking at the Uinta Basin, where now the coloring is the same. So ox total is shown in black, and it's colored by its various components. And so right away, you can see two things. So one, both of these valleys have this characteristic growth in total ox during pollution episodes, but they have very different partitioning. So in the Salt Lake Valley, the ozone is nearly depleted, whereas in the Uinta Basin, it stays fairly consistent throughout that pollution episode. So what this tells us is that it does seem as though photochemistry is important in the Salt Lake Valley, just like it was in the Uinta Basin, due to these highly polluted boundary layers. And ox total is a parameter that you could use to describe both ozone pollution in the Uinta Basin and particulate nitrate pollution in the Salt Lake Valley. And so the question then is, why are they so different in terms of their partitioning? Why did one valley generate a lot of ozone, whereas the other one generated a lot of particulate nitrate? And so we can understand that a little bit better by looking at their emission profiles. So the Salt Lake Valley, which is located right here, is home to Salt Lake City, population of about 1 million, which gives it a density of about 800 people per square kilometer. And while it has the normal emissions of a typical urban area, it has some industry, obviously some transportation, some agriculture. It doesn't have any oil and natural gas wells, whereas The Uinta Basin, which is located over here, is home to Vernal, Utah, population of 50,000, or 2 people per square kilometer. And at the time of the 2013 study, it had about 10,000 active oil and natural gas wells, which generate a huge amount of VOCs. So that can be shown over here in this plot showing NOx versus VOCs. And keep in mind, this is on a log scale. So during these pollution episodes, the Uinta Basin has much, much more VOCs, and the Salt Lake Valley has 1 or 2 orders of magnitude higher NOx. So these are very different emission profiles. And so because these 2 valleys have such different emission profiles, it's helpful to look at the analysis that was done in the Uinta Basin. So again, Pete Edwards, who was our postdoc, who did this study in the Uinta Basin, used a 0-dimensional photochemical box model called DISMAC, which is the dynamically simple model of atmospheric chemical complexity. And so that's shown schematically over here, and it's fairly simple. It uses the MCM for the VOC oxidation chemistry, the TUV model for photochemistry, and we initialize it with observations and then introduce a constant source of emissions, as well as a simple first-order loss parameter. And these 0-dimensional box models are useful to us because you could argue that during these PCAP events, you've got your emissions into what seems sort of like a box. It's a valley with not a lot of vertical or horizontal wind. It's a fairly consistent emission rate. And so we think that these PCAPs are sort of box-like, and using a 0-dimensional box model greatly simplifies things. And 3D models also have their problems trying to model this complex topography. So to do this model, Pete actually took one additional step to try and accurately model this diurnal profile of the residual layer, where it was mixed during the day and then split into 2 at night. And so he, instead of just using one constant loss parameter, he actually used a bimodal loss parameter where it was higher during the day to model the mixing of those the stable boundary layer and the residual layer into the mixed layer during the day. So using this model, he, again, was able to successfully model the ozone growth during one of those pollution episodes. And then once he had this model, he was able to play around with the NOx and VOC emissions to build an isopleth by taking the final modeled day of ozone and then adjusting the NOx and VOC emissions between 0 and twice of what that base case was. And so this isopleth, of course, is a pretty standard way to look at ozone pollution as a function of its sensitivity to both NOx and VOCs. So this was the base case right in the center, and then the contours show the effect of increasing or decreasing your NOx emissions. And over on the right are the two axes pulled out. So what this was demonstrating was that the system was sensitive to both VOCs and NOx, and in particular, it's really right at near the peak of its efficiency for producing ozone relative to NOx. So because this was successful, we wanted to do a similar modeling study for the Salt Lake Valley, this time modeling Ox total instead of ozone. Yes. However, there's one other thing that I do have to mention that was different about those 2 valleys. So this is a plot just showing just the ozone in the 2 valleys. So Uinta is in black and Salt Lake Valley is in green. And what you can see is that, like I showed before, the ozone is basically titrating during the day at the surface in the Salt Lake Valley. And so what that does is if there's no ozone, then that turns off all of the nighttime chemistry. But what we found from the Twin Otter profiles is that that's just at the surface. That doesn't reflect what was going on in the upper part of the inversion layer. So over here, I'm showing several vertical profiles that just showed the concentration of NO2 and ozone, as well as the production of NO3 at night. And so you can see that as was observed at the surface, the ozone is very low at the surface, but it's not at all low up aloft. So we wanted to accurately model that behavior by allowing the chemistry to propagate through the nighttime chemistry even aloft and not just reflect what was at the surface. So the one change that we made from Pete's model to mine was to develop what we would call a split box model, which was basically just modeling the day and then stopping the model at night, splitting it into two, one that modeled the residual layer and one that modeled the nocturnal boundary layer, and then mixing them again the next day. And so, yeah, so this is, for anyone who's interested in the model details, that was just a schematic of the model that we ended up using, where we were allowing photochemistry and first order loss parameter during the day, and then we were turning off the emissions in the residual layer and turning off the entrainment in the nocturnal boundary layer at night. So I'm happy to answer more questions about how that model worked if anyone is interested. And so, yeah, there were a few other parameters that we didn't have a good experimental constraint on, such as the albedo and a direct measure of the entrainment. So what we ended up having to do was a two-dimensional search to find the best combination of parameters that matched the experiment, and that's shown over on the right. And so you can see the black was the observed, and then the red was the modeled ox total. So we were able to successfully model our ox total using a similar type of zero-dimensional box model. Okay, so once we had that base case, I was able to do the same thing that Pete did, which was to take the final day ox total and start changing the NOx and VOC emissions to come up with a isopleth, but this time it's an isopleth of ox total rather than ozone. And so that's shown here, and our base case is right in the center, and I've pulled out, again, these two axes, where the black shows their base case, and then by following those axes along, you can see what the effect is of decreasing either your NOx or your VOC. And so what you can see here is that unlike in the Uinta Basin, the Salt Lake Valley appears to be very much in the NOx-saturated regime. So that means that decreases in NOx will actually increase your ox total. And by looking at the output of that model for both ozone and the particulate nitrate, you can see that decreasing your NOx is going to increase both ozone and particulate nitrate. So this is interesting to us, perhaps a little bit surprising, because what this is indicating to us is that what we knew was that the Salt Lake Valley was limited by its formation of nitric acid. And I said before that tends to imply that you're also limited in NOx. But what we're finding is the opposite. We're actually saturated in NOx. And so therefore, efforts to control the NOx alone without also reducing your VOCs may have the effect of actually increasing the pollution in the Salt Lake Valley. And I want to say that it's hard to compare isopleths because the VOC profiles are different in both valleys, but you can approximately think of the Uinta Basin as being much higher in VOCs and much lower in NOx. So it's maybe somewhere over here in this part of the isopleth where it's sensitive to both reductions in NOx and VOCs. So to try and understand why this is happening, we found that it was really helpful to look at the Hawk's chain length as a parameter. So to explain what that is, I just want to bring back the cartoon showing the chemistry. And now I've gotten rid of the some of the more irrelevant mechanisms, and I'm just looking at this part of the Hawk's cycle. And now I've colored these reactions according to whether they are propagation reactions throughout that cycle or termination reactions. And the Hawk's chain length is defined as the ratio of the propagation reactions versus the termination reactions. So the higher your Hawk's chain length is, the more times one VOC propagated around this cycle, and each time it does that, it generates an NO2, which then makes ozone. So the higher your Hawk's chain length is, the more times it has gone around and made an ozone. And so we were able to pull those numbers out of the two box models, and that's shown over there. And you can see that the Uinta Basin, which is shown in red, has a Hawkes chain length that peaks up around 6. So that means it's making this cycle many times, and each time it's generating an ozone. Whereas the Salt Lake Valley has a Hawkes chain length that peaks around 1, which means it only does it once and then terminates. And we also found that the Uinta Basin tends to terminate in these two reactions, whereas in the Salt Lake Valley, it tends to terminate as nitric acid. So what that tells us is that we can explain this different behavior between the two valleys by just looking at the VOC to NOx ratio. So in the Uinta Basin, because there's such a high VOC to NOx ratio, it propagates that cycle many times, making the ozone. Whereas in the Salt Lake Valley, the NOx is actually playing the role of quenching that cycle. So it goes around once and then terminates in the form of nitric acid. So just in the last few minutes, I do want to talk about a few other things about this, this model. The first thing is that we were very concerned about all of the simplifications that we were making in this model, because there were some by necessity. So we spent a lot of time looking at sensitivity tests. And so the first thing that we did was we understood that this was not the ideal way to model albedo and entrainment. So what we ended up doing was pulling out not just the base case, but a bunch of different points, a bunch of different combinations of those two parameters, and looking at what the predicted ox would be, and more importantly, where it lies on that isopleth. And so these are just cutouts from isopleths for different combinations of those parameters. And what you can see is that although choosing different combinations of parameters may change the absolute size of that isopleth, it's not actually changing where we lie on the isopleth. So no matter what, we're always in this NOx-saturated VOC-limited regime. And likewise, I don't have all of the plots here, but we also were concerned about the assumptions we were making about HONO and N2O5 uptake and dry deposition. So we did a lot of work modeling all of those parameters and seeing how sensitive our results were to those parameters. And so what we found was actually none of these tests actually made any difference to where we were. We always found that we were in the NOx-saturated portion of that curve. And so then finally, the other thing that I did just want to mention is that the benefit of this zero-dimensional box model is because it's so easy to go in and pull out information about the chemistry, it allowed us to really look at what the nighttime versus daytime formation mechanisms were contributing. And so what I've shown here are the daytime mechanism for nitric acid formation, which is OH plus NO2, versus the N2O5 uptake. And so we can plot that during the 4 days of the model, separated out by the upper residual layer and the nocturnal boundary layer. And so what we can pull out is a number of about 45% of that nitric acid formation that's occurring at night. But the reason that I bring it up is because if you were just looking at the surface, you would not have seen that. You would expect that that number would be a lot lower because all of that nighttime chemistry is occurring aloft. So this just emphasizes the benefit of having that light aircraft that was doing those vertical profiles in the valley. So I just want to finish with this last slide, which sort of discusses some future outlooks for this, particularly in Beijing, which has this severe wintertime PM2.5 pollution, and it's not as dramatically dominated by ammonium nitrate, but there is a significant contribution of ammonium nitrate. And it also has very high NOx and high ammonia, which, although you would need to do modeling on the specific system, it could imply that the same kind of thing that we're seeing in Salt Lake Valley could also be relevant in Beijing, although you would have to do more modeling to be sure. And of course, this is something that we are interested in because a recent study showed that NOx has begun to decline in China. I believe that this is just Beijing data, that may not be true everywhere in China, but VOCs don't seem to have had the same sort of recent decline. So just to summarize, we've started using this ox total parameter as a parameter that can describe both ozone and nitric acid production, and it really emphasizes how closely linked those two types of pollution are in the winter. They are really just endpoints of the same chemical cycle, and so therefore the same sort of framework that we use to look at ozone pollution, the NOx-VOC sensitivity isopleth, can also be used to look at nitric acid formation. And specifically in the Salt Lake Valley, although it is nitric acid limited, we find that it is NOx saturated, and therefore NOx reductions will initially increase the particulate nitrate unless they're coupled with concurrent VOC reductions. And we would be interested to see how general this phenomenon is. And with that, I'd just like to thank the people in my group over there, as well as the many people who were involved in the UW-FPS study. And I can take any questions.
Great, thanks. Are there any questions?
Hi, Carrie. Just a technical question. So you were commenting about the importance of the N2O5 uptake to form nitric acids, which means you need to know something about the aerosol concentration. So how did you describe that in the modeling work?
So we had a measure of the number concentration and the surface area. And I used, so Erin McDuffie has been working extensively with the N2O5 uptake. She provided the parameters that described that. So it was a few reactions in the MCM that just described N2O5 being taken up. And if you want to know the actual numbers, I can look them up and send them to you.
Are there more questions?
So are you very familiar with Ulaanbaatar and its pollution in Mongolia?
No.
I just wonder if it was similar chemistry to this, or if it's completely unrelated because of different sources. Because they have the most severe pollution, wintertime pollution in the world, I think.
Yeah. I have to say I'm not that familiar with it, but if it's, do you know if it has a high ammonium nitrate contribution?
I don't know if anyone knows.
Yeah.
I saw a monk's name up there, so maybe they know.
I can ask her. But yeah, I haven't actually spent any time thinking about Mongolia.
More questions? No more questions?
You mentioned China and Beijing. There is a decrease indeed in NOx, as you mentioned. There is also an increase in ozone. I mean, it seems that now in China, I mean, the big problem for Chinese is that they didn't expect it, but as they clean up the atmosphere, ozone increases. Now, it could be the easy titration, or, you know, that. But could there be anything related to ammonium nitrate? Or, I mean, is there any change related to ammonium nitrate that could lead to the increase in ozone that is observed?
You're talking about something like there's a branching ratio, and by taking up more NOx.
Right.
That's a great question. I would be really interested to know, but I haven't actually analyzed any Beijing data, but I think that would be really interesting, especially to, I mean, the benefit of the Ox total parameter is that it lets you look at both types of pollution at the same time, and so you could certainly model it and look at the ratio between those two and try and figure out how they're interacting with each other.
There are more questions?
I have no idea whether or not this is something that needed to be looked at or should be looked at, but did you guys investigate any halogen chemistry? That was pretty impressive ozone depletion, and just the fact that you were over a salt lake, I was curious whether or not there was any impact of bromine chemistry. Did you look at the VOCs for that?
So specifically for this, I included, you know, all of the halogen chemistry that was available to put into into the MCM. And I didn't find that it was making much of a difference. I did some sensitivity tests with ClNO2. In terms of looking specifically at that halogen chemistry, we have all this really interesting data looking at those ozone depletion events, but we're still in the process of looking at it.
VOC measurements of acetylene?
We didn't have VOC measurements on the plane, unfortunately. And that was when we got closest to the lake and to the production facilities that were on the other side of the lake. So yeah, we wish that we had had VOCs on the plane, but we didn't.
It's always good to have VOCs.
Yeah.
I have just a quick question. Maybe it's not really related. I don't know. You mentioned like aerosols were measured during the campaign.
Yes.
Like aerosol optical properties.
No.
Okay.
There were two AMSs, there were some SMPSs, UHSAS, but unless I'm forgetting something, Ali, I don't think that there was any aerosol optical properties.
Not to remember.
Yeah.
Okay. So, there are more questions? No, let's think again. Caroline?